Coming up, the top political risks for 2014.
I think when you put all of these things together, you get an international environment where the United States is not doing as much.
Eurasia Group's Ian Bremmer discusses the decline of U.S. foreign policy, instability in China, and Middle East turmoil. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Welcome to Top Risks and Ethical Decisions with Ian Bremmer. He was previously a trustee here. He is the president of Eurasia Group. He is author of several fantastic books, including the bestseller, The End of the Free Market, and he also received his PhD from Stanford.
Let me start with the big point, which is that since 2008, the financial crisis, the big risks have largely been economic, right? They've followed on from the financial crisis. They've been about the U.S. Fiscal cliff, debt limit, downgrade, of course, initially, will the banking system implode, all of that, but fundamentally economic risk. Europe, the Eurozone, will it collapse? Will it crater? Will it disintegrate? You guys know where I've been on that over the last few years. Absolutely hell no. But nonetheless, that's been big risks that people have talked about. Potential for a Chinese hard landing following the 2008 financial crisis, that they wouldn't be able to grow the way that they have shown that they can still consistently grow year on year. Those risks aren't with us in 2014. Now, as we look towards 2014, it's not that I have a new set of economic risks that I'm going to throw out. It's that actually the politics are becoming more significant. The economic risks are receding. The geopolitical risks are becoming more important. And so I think I'd like to take you through thematically some of those. And I'm going to start with the big one. Again, those of you that have seen me and heard me in the past know that I am not a declinist. I fundamentally do not believe the United States is in decline. I do not believe the U.S. economy is in decline. And very importantly, other countries agree with that. And CEOs agree with that. And we see the investments in the U.S. We see the market performance as a consequence. We see the strength of the dollar. However, and I'm very sorry to say this. I'm very sorry to feel this. I do now believe, for the first time, that U.S. foreign policy is in decline. And I think it's true for a lot of reasons. Let me first say that Obama is responsible for some of them, but I don't think I'd give him 50%. I think I'd probably put Obama I'd give him about a third. His decisions, his lack of decisions, his team, and all of that. So I kind of line up where we are. I mean, the last year has been tough in foreign policy. Snowden, Syria, the government shutdown, the impact of Obama not going to the APEC summit, all of that. The quality of the second-term team. The second-term foreign policy team, broadly speaking, is not the first-term team. John Kerry is not Hillary Clinton. Jack Lew is not Tim Geithner, right? You just don't have, not only do you not have the same capacity, but you also don't have the trust from Obama on the foreign policy officials that you did the first time around. I think that is a problem. But more broadly than that, you also have American allies that are less willing to provide significant support for U.S. initiatives. A Germany-led Europe is harder for the Americans to align with internationally than a Britain or even a France-led Europe, because the Germans don't do geopolitics. They do geoeconomics, and they do them bilaterally. Unlike the Brits and the French, whose general worldview is more similar, has the same kind of narrative that of the United States has. There are more countries out there that are more willing to throw a spanner in the works of U.S. outcomes, like the Russians, like the Chinese, more capable, more interested in doing so than they have been historically. So I think when you put all of these things together, you get an international environment where the United States is not doing as much, is not interested in doing as much, and is getting a lot of pushback. I think this has big implications for the international marketplace, for international security. It's very clear. I mean, Obama said during the United Nations meeting a few months ago that the U.S. does not want to be the world's policeman.
But we cannot and should not bear that burden alone.
Now, it may well be that the United States wants to be the world's private investigator, but that is even less popular as a role, and that's not gone well. As I look towards 2014, I see the Americans with certain relationships that can't go anywhere. You look at the Canadians and the Mexicans, they don't have much economic choice but the US. You look at Japan, Israel, and Britain, they don't have much strategic choice but the US. You go one step below that, just one, and you've got countries with options. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Germany, France, Brazil, South Korea, Indonesia, a lot of countries there. Not small countries. Right? And if I'm Raytheon or if I'm Lockheed, and I know I'm not going to sell more defense material to the Americans because defense budget spending is pretty flat, I really need to be able to sell to a lot of those countries. Well, what happens if the Turks are like, actually, I'd rather buy from the Chinese? The Saudis are, our relationship is broken, I'd rather buy from the French. That's happening. That's a problem. That's an implication of U.S. foreign policy in decline. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, by far the most important U.S. piece of foreign policy affecting the U.S. economy in the world for the past 5-10 years, was supposed to get done by the end of 2013. Didn't happen. Now people are saying definitely going to get done this year. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen in 2015. And that delay matters. And that delay slows what would otherwise be more economic opportunity for American firms and for the U.S. economy to orient more trade and capital flows towards the United States. It impacts Asian economies that are aligned with the U.S. as well. I think about the ability of Cisco or Google or AT&T to do business internationally, and I know that the Germans and French and Brazilians are now saying, how do we know where your data is going? We're going to have new regulations in place. We're going to make you ensure that you aren't just in the cloud, that you have local data centers. They're going to be very expensive. It's going to be very onerous. In part, we're doing that because we're really concerned about what you're doing, and in part, we're doing it because we'd like to benefit our own firms. All of these things are implications of U.S. foreign policy in decline. Some of that can be assuaged and turned around and fixed, but a lot of it can't. I do think that some of this is structural. A second big risk, if the U.S. risk is primarily foreign policy, and it's not domestic. In 2014, the beautiful thing is basically nothing happens in the U.S. domestically, aside from midterm elections. Immigration, probably not going to happen. Bring the minimum wage up, I can't see Republicans supporting that. Tax reform with Baucus going to be ambassador to China, I don't think we do tax reform. Trade Promotion Authority, maybe in the lame duck session in November. But I think that very little happens on the upside in the U.S. domestically, but also very little downside. We've got our budget now in order through 2015. That's actually a big deal. Right? So on balance, I think this is an environment, 2014, where the U.S. domestic side, not very interesting, the U.S. foreign policy side, problematic. And the fact that the U.S. domestic side isn't very interesting is, generally speaking, quite positive for U.S. economic growth, the markets, and all the rest. Okay? Now, when I think about China, it's kind of the opposite. China, for the first time, in a long time, is really in play domestically. Xi Jinping has done more in terms of reform in the last 7-8 months than we had seen in 20 years in China. That really matters. Those things are overdue, right? Anti-corruption, which they're really starting to engage in. And no, not his own family, but serious baby steps. Baby steps. No, but seriously, the fact that they're going after folks who run state-owned enterprises, who are involved in the energy complex in a big way, the fact that they're going to squeeze them on capital, the fact they're going to go around the country and actually make heads of provinces deal with market-based incentives and metrics in terms of how they're going to be the performance reviews and grades they're going to get for their next step in the Communist Party, that's a big deal. The fact that we see a real effort to start opening up the financial sector in terms of the way that oversight is done and wealth management products that don't actually work and shadow lending, and they're going to start bankrupting some banks. Those are important things for the Chinese government to do if they want to restructure their economy towards higher value, consumer-driven entrepreneurship. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take a long time, but they're starting in a way that in the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era, they weren't really starting. Now, at the same time that they're doing that, they are creating losers in the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, why had they not been serious about anti-corruption before? Well, because these are powerful people in an anti-democratic state. And might you not want to annoy them? Because that could bite you. So the other thing that Xi Jinping is doing is political reform, not liberalizing reform, right? But consolidating more power in his hands, creating a national security council that's based a little bit on the American model, but instead of being foreign policy oriented, it's primarily internal security oriented. Why would he do that, you ask? Because if these reforms go badly, if they aren't liked, then he has the ability to bring down the hammer, right? Hence the consolidation. Why would he make life more difficult for dissidents if he's an economic reformer? Why would he make it harder for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Bloomberg to report? Well, precisely because he is starting to engage in reform. In other words, I think this is real, but I don't think this is uniformly positive. It is destabilizing. There's volatility. The Chinese are embarking in the next step of an unprecedented historical experiment. It's never been done this quickly on this kind of scale. They may succeed. We all hope they do. But if they start to fail, we have no idea what the effects of that are going to be. That creates big risk internally in China. I think the China-US relationship is on balance moving in a better direction. Now, how does that comport with the fact that I just said US foreign policy is in decline? Well, actually, senior Chinese leaders like this new Obama administration. Hillary's gone. Kurt Campbell's gone. There's no more pivot. There's no more economic statecraft. This is a group that they think they're not going to get punished by, right? The hardliners on China, like them or don't like them, are basically out. I think that the China relationship these are guys that want to have, in the context of a more difficult economic environment domestically with more challenges, they'd like the US-China relationship to be relatively stable. So they announce a bilateral investment treaty that they want to engage with the US. The US has been trying to get them to do that for a long time. A multilateral trade and services agreement they're willing to be a part of, for example. They are willing to go after Japan, but they're only doing it because they think that they can drive a wedge between the US and Japan. And so far, they've been somewhat successful in doing that. The American response to Prime Minister Abe's visit to Yasukuni War Shrine, the American response, Vice President Biden's response to the air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, very clearly differentiated from what Japanese Prime Minister Abe is doing. That's interesting, right? So a little worried about Japan, China in that regard, right? Maybe more than a little worried. I think that the US-Japan-China relationship is in many ways becoming analogous to the US-Israel-Iran relationship. Do I really mean that? Yeah. In the sense that we like Israel more than anyone else in the Middle East. It's the closest relationship. But we're much more concerned, on balance, about a stable relationship with Iran right now. That's the priority. We want to fix that. And while we're worried about Iran, the Israelis are much more worried about Iran than we are. What does that sound like? Right? We like the Japanese, but we see the China issue as more important and more potential downside that we want to avoid, so we try to balance. We worry about China, but Japan worries about China a lot more. Well, historically, in that dynamic in the Middle East, that's when the Israelis start to actually provoke a little more, because it's like, the Americans are going to forget about us, so we need to ensure that we actually continue to chest beat a little bit, right? Might that be happening in Japan a little bit? Could be. Emerging markets. Emerging markets, broadly speaking, everyone that's a big emerging market that could be having an election in 2014 is pretty much having an election in 2014. China doesn't have elections. Russia doesn't really have elections. Everyone else is pretty much having an election, right? You got the Indian elections, you got the South African elections, you got Brazil, you got Colombia, you got Turkey, right? All over the place, we got big elections. Not much policy gets done when elections occur. The policy does happen, tends to be populist, throw a lot of money that you don't necessarily have. The emerging market growth rates right now and the developed market growth rates, the difference between the two are smaller than we've seen in well over a decade. They're the smallest, right? You get rid of China, you take China out of the equation, and we shouldn't consider China an emerging market. It's the second largest economy in the world. It's going to be the first in relatively short order. It's larger than Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, the other BRICS all put together. You take China out as the overperformer, suddenly those rates look really, really close indeed. And it's not because the developed markets are not going to cover off the ball. It's because the emerging markets have really slowed down, right? In that environment, you have to really think carefully about which emerging markets you want to bet on, which ones you don't want to bet on. And coming out of these elections, some are positioned to do relatively well, some are not. I'm much more of a believer in Colombia, much more of a believer in Indonesia, I think Brazil will do okay. Mexico, no elections this year, but generally the politics are in the right direction, and Mexico is likely to become the world's next developed state, just in the same way that Chile or that South Korea or Taiwan have. But there are other countries that are not set up well. Turkey, very badly. And that's too bad, given everything they have going for them. But Erdogan's willingness to undermine the legitimacy of established political institutions is quite significant. He's becoming a leader in the sort of fashion of Christina Kirchner, in the fashion of Vladimir Putin, and that's clearly affecting the way we think about the trajectory of that economy, particularly because he's next to Europe, which is performing relatively poorly. He's next to a Syrian war, which of course is leading to lots of refugees across the border. He's having a hard time keeping a Kurdish ceasefire in place. And big investments in places like Iraq and the Middle East look a little bit less attractive than they did when Turkey was starting that, right? So Turkey's not what you want it to be. India, you have the potential, everyone very excited about Narendra Modi, the BJP nominee for the upcoming elections. He is pro-investment. He is, generally speaking, reasonably pro-West. Technocrat, people love him. He has a good chance of winning. But he's not going to win by himself. It's going to be a relatively fragmented coalition government that will not be able to actually pass useful economic policy, won't be able to reform, won't be able to move on infrastructure or telecom or banking or retail consumer. All of that is done in a very decentralized fashion. India, it's not going to change. India will continue to underperform. So that's where I see the major emerging markets. You know, clearly the Middle East continues to explode. There's no question about that. But we do know that Syria is becoming less of a risk. Not to the Syrians. I mean, Syria is a problem for the Syrians. But for the rest of us, how much do we care? We all care individually. How much do we care as countries? Apparently not at all, right? I mean, you got 130,000 dead. You got about 2 to 3 million refugees. You've got about 5 to 7 million displaced. The country only has 20 million people, right? It's not a country anymore. But Assad's ability to stay in power, to consolidate power, is actually fairly significant right now. Because he understands that the rebels are not getting support. The rebels get that too. They are actually cutting deals with Syrian military, in many places, local ceasefire. So I think that violence subsides in Syria a little bit. In Egypt, General Sisi is going to run for president, right? You've got Salafists recently, the Noor Party, that have come out and they've said, Muslim Brotherhood, supporting violence. We support the Constitution. They understand they're not going to get support internationally, so they're coming back and supporting the military, right? Even in Iraq, we have all sorts of Sunni tribal leaders that are saying, Al-Qaeda, not our gig. We'll stick with Maliki, thank you very much. So that doesn't mean governance is working in the Middle East. It's not. Certainly the Arab Spring, we shouldn't even mention anymore. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to see violence in these countries. We are. But if you ask me, do these governments look a little bit more stable in the near term, right? Not sustainable, but stable right now in 2014, I would say, yeah, not the way we like, but in a way that will allow the Americans to play less of a role in the Middle East, yes, especially if a deal gets done on Iran, especially if a deal gets done on Iran. Who's the real loser here? Saudis. Saudis really don't want a deal done on Iran. What do the Saudis want? They want continued sanctions forever on Iran. They want a weaker Iran. All right? The sectarian problem for them everywhere, Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, and the rest. Also, if the Iranians, sanctions off, no nukes, Iran produces oil. Why would the Saudis want that? They don't. The Saudis are real. The U.S.-Saudi relationship is broken. There are lots of countries that have relationships with the U.S. right now that are broken for bad reasons. Brazil, Germany, France, get back to the point. The Saudi relationship with the U.S. is actually broken for good reasons. These are two countries whose relations, the alignment between these two states, just no longer holds. The Americans and the Saudis, if they take an honest look at each other, should no longer get along. That is, if I were advising the Saudis, I'd be like, yeah, sorry, right? And we get it. We will not be honest with each other because we're diplomats. But the reality is that, right? So I think that that's going to cause problems for these guys, and I do worry. I start to worry in a much more significant way in the short to medium term that we might start to see more instability in the kingdom itself. The other place that will get hurt as a consequence of this are the places that rely on the Saudis and the Qataris and the other major oil producers for largesse. So Lebanon, Are they going to have the same cash to throw the Lebanese that they have historically? I don't think so. Are they going to have the same interest? Probably not. That's going to be a challenge. So that's kind of where we are. Thank you very, very much.
All right. Thank you.
What do you see about risks related to North Korea besides more basketball games?
Yeah. So I was with a friend of mine today, I'm not going to identify him, who over lunch, and I asked him, he's in a position to be intelligent on this, I asked him what he believed the likelihood was that Rodman is talking to the CIA. He said 100%. My view is 80. It's 100% that Rodman is talking to someone who's CIA, but he's not aware of that. That's 100%. The question is whether he's actually proactively helping. What I think about Rodman, we have no information on this country. And here's a guy that somehow has managed to go regularly in and talk to the leader. Any American that knows anything in intelligence would want him to keep doing that. There's absolutely no question. Not only by himself, but now with other people who might actually be able to say something coherent. That's good. I found it really interesting, just a weird thing. So one of the guys that went with Rodman is this Columbia neuroscience professor. Did anyone see that? Right? I haven't had a chance to check this out yet. I have no idea if that guy's crazy or not, right? But I will tell you one thing. There's a group in the CIA, and all they do is try to assess, on the basis of tapes and all the rest, on the basis of how people look and how they act and everything, whether or not they have actual mental impairments and emotional impairments, right? I want to know why this guy went on that trip. I find that interesting, right? And I'm saying these things because we know so little. And this is a place where, yeah, the uncle was executed, and there are now rumors that the aunt, Kim Jong-il's sister, has suddenly had a heart attack. We don't know if they're true or not. The fact is that this is a guy who is doing lots of things that do not comport well with his continuing to be able to rule a totalitarian state. And sudden implosion in North Korea is not something that anybody actually is looked forward to. Now, the good news, if you call this good news, is he's such a wild card, and he's gone after somebody, this uncle that the Chinese were working in an okay way with. The Chinese have gotten annoyed. And U.S.-China relations on North Korea have actually been a little bit more constructive of late. So were there to be implosion, the potential that the Americans and the Chinese would be able to not be at each other's throats over this issue is not high, but it's a little higher than it was. That's good. But the problem I have is I'm trying to advise people that have massive exposure to South Korean electronics manufacturing and outsourcing. And I don't know what to tell these people because, North Korea implodes, you got a problem there. And yet a lot of these firms like Samsung, they're making things that you couldn't easily repurpose or resource into other countries. So it's hard to actually figure out what to do with your South Korea exposure.
The Obama administration has talked a lot about income inequality being one of the next big issues that American society needs to face. So I was wondering if you saw that as an internal destabilizing factor in the long term.
So I posted on my Twitter account, there's this amazing map that was produced by the National Geographic that shows the entire world in black, and then it has different colors reflecting income all over the world. And rich nations, it both has people and then density of people for how bright it is in different colors, right? And you look and you realize that America, the richest in the world is blue. Well, it's not like West Virginia isn't blue. It's not like Mississippi isn't blue. It's either no population in some parts of the US or it's the richest you can be compared to other countries in the world, right? This is this huge splotch of blue. And you realize we can talk about income inequality all you want, but the poorest Americans are rich. The poorest Americans are comfortable. I'm not saying that because I don't care about them. I'm not saying that because I think we can just sort of leave them alone. But the fact is that global poverty, true crushing poverty has been halved in the last 20 years. And you might be able to get rid of it in the next 20. That's an extraordinary story. And in many ways, it's a more important story and a more destabilizing story, because what happens when these people now have internet and the rest and move into cities? And it used to be that we don't have to worry about Al-Shabaab and organizations like that because they don't have the ability to cause trouble. What happens when all of a sudden they have the ability to have denial of service attacks against Americans and their cards from Target? I want to focus the conversation that way. The other reason I focus the conversation that way is because who talks about Occupy Wall Street anymore? I haven't gotten a question on that for a very long time. I'm the one that keeps bringing it up to say that nobody talks about it, right? Obama can talk about income inequality till he's blue in the face. So can Republicans. It doesn't matter, right? We're not doing anything. There's no legislative impulse in the United States to make a meaningful difference on this. And I'm not saying it'll never happen. I'm just saying we're so close to it being urgent, right? And that's sad because the opportunities that exist for Americans have been narrowed for large portions of the population. That's not the country that immigrants from all over the world historically came to America for. That's a story that's kind of sad. And yet, we still are, by far, the richest country in the world. And not only that, but we're now the largest energy producer. We're the largest food producer. We've got the entrepreneurship and the technology. We're the country that everybody wants to bet on in a bigger way than they did before the 2008 financial crisis. So it's really hard to have people get up there and say, we've got to do something about our poor 50%. It's just not urgent.
Let's give a huge thank you to Ian Bremmer.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.